Hey, so these are the 11 tarot decks that I have that are actually complete decks that have the major and minor arcana. So I figured I'd take these out and show you through all the decks and show you the differences between each deck and what in each deck makes me feel that it's a good deck for reading with. And also just generally what I like, since I know some of these things that are make or breaks for me are not going to be nearly as big a thing for you. And everyone's got different tastes. So we're going to start with this one over here, which is kind of an oddball. It's the Manera Erotic Tarot. This one right here. It's put out by Scarabeo. And it's basically just the erotic artist Manera's pinups, all assigned each to a tarot card. And some of them fit pretty well, and some of them are like, huh, what are you doing? I was kind of skeptical of this deck, but once I got it, I actually really enjoyed using it. It's pretty frank in the readings it gives, and since I know the Rider-Waite-Smith deck so well, I can basically remember the meanings if the art on the card here just doesn't have enough connection for what it should actually be telling me. I've kept two of these flipped over because the Erotic Tarot is a little bit too erotic, I think, for my channel. But this one is the Queen of Wands, and it's basically a lady that is saying, stick it in my butt. I know, I'm not making that up. That's just, you know, full on, hey, put it in there. So that's the kind of stuff you're going to expect whenever you get this tarot deck. I wouldn't say every single card is porntastic. I mean, this one is, like, not very risque at all, to be honest. But only use this deck with people who you know are going to actually enjoy this sort of thing. It's really good with relationships, and also just good with, like, blunt, frank advice. And it's kind of humorous in how it gives messages, I find. So, interesting things about the deck. It has a different border color for each suit and also for the majors. And for the suits, instead of having the regular tarot suits, it has air, earth, fire, and water. And it's about as you'd expect. Air is swords. So this is the Nine of Swords, which is usually like the Nightmares card. But here is not so much. So, I mean, I guess it could seem kind of foreboding, but I'm just not seeing the usual excruciating terror of the Nine of Swords in this card. Whereas the Fool, like, this is one of the first cards for the Fool I've seen where there's two actual humanesque figures, unless the puppet's supposed to be like the dog on the Fool. It doesn't really have any of the usual imagery that you get with the Fool. I guess since if this is a Pinocchio story, then Pinocchio still learning how to be a person could sort of be an allegory for the beginning of the Fool's journey, but I'm not really there with it. So this deck is really hit or miss, and I would say get it if you want kind of a relationships reading deck that is out of the norm, and if you're interested in seeing much different interpretations of cards than usual. And as far as things go, I mean, there are plenty of decks out there that are really just someone taking some nice art and putting it to a card name without it actually being made to be a tarot card. And as decks like that go, this one is actually pretty alright. One of the better ones. So, it's a good one to read with, regardless of the weird things about it. So, in the middle here, we've got the Scarabeo Tarot. It's basically the flagship tarot of the publishing company. And what they did was basically take the Rider-Waite-Smith and Thoth Tarot, sort of examine both of them, and then add in what they thought were the best attributes. Also including the the Marseille Tarot in some details. And I'll go ahead and flip this over. I just had this like this so you could see the backs. There's nothing scandalous here, so that's the Queen of Wands on this deck. And basically, it's really well illustrated. The faces are very detailed. The characters are just really, really well rendered. And all of the details that I really look for in a tarot deck tend to be on each card in this deck. I really like the Fool that they have. The Fool looks very confident going out, but could look like they could have maybe a confidence fall coming up. There's a butterfly in the little glyph on top of this arch. It's a little hard to see in this video. And he's got just generally all the stuff that a Fool tends to have. The Nine of Swords, this card shows off how well this deck does with the minors, because this is the Nightmare card, and this one really just has it all. Let me see if I can get in here so you can see the details. But not only do we have this person who's got like a very disturbed nightmare thing going on, but there's a trap door behind him here. You can see the latch on it. There's a lock, so he's actually in an attic with a trapdoor by him. And right here by his robe is the key to that trapdoor. So it's not just talking about him having nightmares, it's also going on to say this person having nightmares is really worrying over something, and they may have control over no longer worrying about that thing. So all these elements have really popped up whenever I've done readings. Sometimes the key isn't important and sometimes it is. Because these cards have to be versatile, they have to address situations from all kinds of different angles. So here we have the Hanged Man. This one has pretty much everything you expect from the Hanged Man. To be honest, I think every single deck that you're going to look at here has all of the little symbolisms of the Hanged Man in varying degrees. No one really diverts that much from what you expect. Oh, except for Prism of Visions. That one had to be the standout. Alright, so basically it's... The Hanged Man is supposed to be in this traditional stance of like meditation during like a ordeal while they're trying to get visions and see outside their tortured situation. So the thing about it is that it's not someone who is there unwillingly, but they are going through an ordeal. I like that the Lo Scarabeo one has the snake hanging him, because that's just like, not only does that get into a lot of Kabbalah and alchemy symbolism, but it's also just a really difficult situation to stay in, like being hung by a snake. So, and then Queen of Wands I already showed for a bit. I like the confidence in this figure. I like pretty much everything that they've rendered about her. And she's got the sunflower and she's got the cat. Those are like the two details that I always look for. This has actually been my significator card for most of the time. So it's really important to me that a deck gets this card right, because it's usually my favorite. So it's basically, it's the Leo card, and it's doing a really good job at being the Leo card. So after that, we've got the Silhouettes Tarot. It's a limited edition deck that you have to order online through the artist's website, Masa September. And it's a really, really good deck. If you can get your hands on it, I really suggest you do. It is kind of scarce. This is the first edition, which is no longer being sold. So the Silhouettes Tarot is very interesting. It takes symbolism from the Rider-Waite-Smith primarily, although I think I've seen a few things that tip towards the artist also looking at Thoth. And it doesn't stick to the Rider-Waite-Smith religiously. It takes that inspiration and it goes in its own direction style-wise and just generally story-wise. This is a very storytelling deck. I'll go ahead and flip over the back of this so you can see there's the Queen of Wands here. If you like the anime Revolutionary Girl Utena, then you're going to like this deck. It has all of that fairy tale silhouette sort of style going on. If you like fairy tales, you're going to like this deck. It's really amazing in how it's got this whimsical style, but it can render some really, really disturbing and dark imagery. Like, this Nine of Swords is a great Nine of Swords. It's got all of the nightmares, all of the worry, all of the dwelling on these things. Really implies that you're super dwelling on these things that are just really dragging you down. There's something on your mind. There's something eating away at you. Like, you may even have a curse on you. I mean, there's just so much that's possibly going on in that card. It just really hammers it home. You wouldn't ever have to look at a Rider-Waite-Smith deck or know the symbolism of tarot to understand what is going on in this card. And I think that is really the goal for especially any card in the minor arcana that isn't a royal. Like, they really need to be able to communicate what is actually going on their own without a book. So, the Fool has most of the things you expect. There's a cliff, there's a dog, he's kind of prancing. That's pretty much it. It's got that big sunburst imagery, youth, all of that. So, it is what you would expect. The Hanged Man is also what you would expect. It is a very cheerful Hanged Man. It's like, hey, I'm just hanging here, but I'll talk to you, Mr. Fox. What's going on? It kind of implies that you're going to get messages in whatever sort of trance that you're going to be inside of as the Hanged Man from fox spirit animals. And that's pretty much all it does. It doesn't really vary from the traditional stuff too much. Queen of Wands has everything there that I want to have there. It's got a cat, it's got a sunflower, it's got a very dominant creative figure that looks like they have a lot of charisma. And it has bees, which I don't always see on this card, but I do see bees throughout the wands usually, so that's nice to see. And then over here, we've got Tarot of the Cat People. This is kind of an older deck. It's put out by US Games. And it's very interesting because it's actually kind of a science fiction deck. This author thought of like these 4 different people on this planet and like 4 different community tribes type of people. And basically told all of their stories through a tarot deck. So that was pretty neat. She also tends to reproduce this fashion herself and cosplay in it. I have a cat. That's what cats do. Alright. While I'm doing the Cat People deck. Alright. So, the Fool, there's a cliff, there's not a cat, there's not a dog, there's a cat. There's a guy setting out with a stick. He's not really looking where he's going and he's about to fall. I could take it or leave it. There often is imagery with the Fool that has like a jaguar going at some dude's heel or a tiger. You can see that up here on the Thoth Tarot Fool. And that has some mythology attached to it. So that imagery is proper. It's just, I'm not really getting it with the Fool here. He's so mellow. He's not really setting out. He's just kind of like, I might just stand here. Nine of Swords is kind of disappointing too. Like, this guy looks like he could be worried. The cat is definitely looking like they're not getting any sleep. Like, red eyes, staring out. Oh my gosh, the things I see in my sleep. I cannot sleep. But the dude's just kind of like, why do all my swords keep falling off the wall? So, Hanged Man is, again, it's what you'd expect. There's an ordeal, some guy's hanging there. I like that the cat is like, whatever, you're gonna do your ordeal, I'm just gonna nap up here. I think this really encapsulates what cats are like. And then for the Queen of Wands, no sunflowers on this planet. And the royals in this deck I can usually take or leave because they don't express a whole lot. She's got a wand in her hand. She's got a cat there, but I mean, it's Tarot of the Cat People, so everybody's got cats. So, there's a different type of cat for each of these tribes. There are lynxes for the wands, but for the swords, we have this other stripy cat. It's interesting to know. The Tarot of the Cat People, it's been a cute deck to use, and I can read with it. and sometimes it's got an interesting perspective, but it really doesn't do as much as the other decks, I find. I think most of the imagery is here for storytelling. There's an actual, like, world this person has created and they want to tell stories in, and so the deck sort of matches that. But I find that it doesn't make as strong a tarot because it's more focused on storytelling that world than it is on storytelling the tarot. So it's nice to have in terms of art, but not really one of my go-to reading decks. And then up here we have the Homestuck Tarot, which I thought was just going to be like a bunch of pieces of art in a tarot deck, and it was going to be fun fan stuff, but it wasn't actually going to be a deck that I used to read for people a lot. And I was wrong. I actually picked mine up whenever the Homestuck game Kickstarter was going on, and I'm really glad I did because it's been one of the best decks I've used. Here's the Nine of Swords in this deck. That's actually Andrew Hussey, the creator of the webcomic Homestuck. FYI, Homestuck is a webcomic that's incredibly popular and incredibly long, and it actually has over 9,000 pages. I'm not joking. They literally have over 9,000 pages. It's a good story. It's really hard to track and explain. But basically, for you to use this deck and really read with it, I think you have to know Homestuck. I don't think that to get a reading from this deck, you have to know Homestuck. Basically, the reader, the person who gives the fortune, who does all the interpretation, they need to know Homestuck, because otherwise this deck it makes absolutely no sense. It's just incomprehensible. You can still kind of go along with some of the cards, but some of them just literally are meaningless. These four are actually not a good example of that, because you can still kind of make it through with that Nine of Swords, I think, even though you're not, who is this guy? I don't know, Queen of Wands just doesn't really do it unless you know who this character is. If you do, you're like, oh yeah, Queen of Wands, that one, that character that I like so much that I know all the things about. They're perfect for the Queen of Wands. But if you don't know this character, you're like, why is there this woman sitting in a martini glass? Why does she have a gun? What does this have to do with tarot? Where are the wands? And then, actually, I never noticed that she actually has a cat with her. It's her little mutant cat in the cup right there, and I just never saw that because the card is so dark. So she's even got a cat. Check that out. For the Hanged Man, we have John sleeping. This is kind of an ordeal. It's not what you'd normally expect, but he's still got that classic Hanged Man pose. I really like that. It still calls back to the card. He's probably... There's like a lot of Homestuck stuff I could say about this that has to do with the card, so that's a good thing. But if you're not into Homestuck, like, I'm not sure if this card would really come across to you as much. Their Fool is just... It's Dave, and I'm not sure why Dave is the Fool. And I know what he's sitting on top of, but if you don't read Homestuck, this card is just really weird. So, if you know Homestuck, this deck is really great to read with. And the person who receives the reading that you're doing the reading for, they don't have to know Homestuck. Like, I've done this for people who just have never read Homestuck, and they've understood their readings perfectly fine. So don't let that be a barrier if you want to get this deck. You don't have to read for only people who are Homestuck fans. Alright, so here we have Tumblr's favorite deck, Prism of Visions. Prism of Visions, there's like a whole long history to it, but basically it's like this deck that this artist did, and everybody really likes it. I say it like that because I don't actually like this deck a whole bunch, personally. I don't think it's a bad deck. I think there's lots of things that are great about it. It's just not my personal style. But, so what's interesting about this Prism of Visions, which I'm actually going to do a cheat. I was only going to show 4 cards for each of these, but for this one, I am going to actually go and get 2 more cards to show you the trick about the Prism of Visions. So, what's neat about the Prism of Visions is that each suit actually goes side to side to make one long picture. And I think that's really neat. And I think that it really works with the style. And it tells one story, each one does, which is what tarot should be doing. It's just that, like, to me, the Queen of Wands doesn't really communicate what I normally look for in a Queen of Wands. The Hanged Man is, like, messed up. I know that, like, there's a whole book that comes with this deck, so if I read all the stories, I'd know what's going on, but I haven't read all the stories. So I kind of feel like somebody who doesn't know Homestuck trying to use the Homestuck deck. So I can't really tell you what all is going on in the Hanged Man. I haven't read the story. But from this point, it's like, is that guy even still alive? 'Cause this card is not about being dead. If he's still alive, then he's definitely in an ordeal place where he can't really kick around because he's going to get bit by fish. But so he definitely has to stay in a serene position until something new turns up. But it's odd. The Fool is a pelican at a pier, and I am sure that this is really symbolic for other people who aren't me. But it's interesting to note that the minor arcana do not have any borders to be able to do that continuous art thing. The major arcana do have borders. So that's what distinguishes them. The major arcana do not tell a story end to end the way that the minor arcana do. The Nine of Swords is definitely a nightmarish position. It's you looking at impending doom. I'd only say that the Nine of Swords, I like when the card implies that you may be dwelling on something too much, but this card, you can't really imply that as much because it seems rather reasonable to dwell on the fact that you're about to have your head bit off by this giant terror bird. So you could just say that there's a metaphorical terror bird that you're, like, blowing up too much, I suppose. But yeah, so that deck, like, if you like it, you really, 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 really like it, and if you don't, then you don't care about it. So everybody knows, like, the original Rider-Waite-Smith deck, right? Right. I've pretty much gotten it here so that I can just show you what these cards... Most people think of the Rider-Waite-Smith when they think of these cards. You've got Thoth too, and you've got the other older tarots, but this one really is just established for people's consciousness what tarot even looks like. So there's our roots. This deck is super, super old. I got it when I was like 12 or 14. My mom randomly got it for me because she knew that I was into, like, spooky stuff. And she was right. That was my first deck. That's why these cards are so beat up and curved and stuff. I have actually taken this deck to the swamp whenever I was a teenager to do readings. So it has been pretty much everywhere. And lasted pretty long, and I can still read with it. So this is the Archangel Power Tarot cards by Doreen Virtue. You may know Doreen Virtue from basically lots and lots and lots of cheesy angel-based oracle decks. She is the princess of cheesy, cheesy, cheesy oracle decks. You know it's a Doreen Virtue deck because she puts the meaning of the card right at the bottom for you in case you were not sure how to interpret it. I don't usually like that style. I got this deck because it was at Barnes & Noble and I wanted to play a prank on myself, I guess. I did not expect to ever read with this deck regularly except for, like, maybe drunk readings or joke readings. And I never thought that it would actually be insightful. And I didn't even think that it would be a well-made deck. And I was wrong about all of that, and it's really, really weird. So one interesting thing about the Archangel Power Tarot is that it actually has people in it who are not white. And that's extremely rare for tarot decks. I mean, we've got it with the cat people, but they're on another planet. So you've definitely got the different looks of people, but you couldn't really say exactly what their heritages are because they're fantasy people, whereas these are more like real people that you could meet. And it's rare to have a tarot deck actually represent anybody besides white people. It just feels like there's so many artists who don't even bother to think about that. I will mention that the Manera Erotic Tarot, while being a really weird deck, actually has people in it who are not white as well. So it actually wins some points for representation. But one thing that the Archangel Tarot also has going for it is that it's actually really well thought out. And I did not expect that. So the trump cards, the major arcana, are in purple. This is the Hanged Man, but it's called Perspective instead. Each major arcana has an archangel assigned to it. And then it's got the meaning written at the bottom. Now, when I'm reading with these cards, actually the meaning written at the bottom tends to come into my reading. It's not like I use that as literally the meaning of the card each time, but I take some of the words from it, and it usually starts inspiring me for what this card can mean to someone. And here he's like, kind of some, like, acrobat at a circus, I guess? I mean, I made a joke about this being the Dark Carnival, but wouldn't that be an ordeal, being trapped at the Dark Carnival? Meditating with Fago. So, the Fool card, Leap of Faith, instead of being the Fool. These really are not made for people who have read tarot before. These are made for people who are usually using Doreen Virtue's Angel Oracle decks. They're super fluffy, super positive. They do a lot of power of positive thinking stuff that I don't tend to think is actually a good idea. But this deck actually is made well. So the suits are interesting because instead of being elements or tools, they are actually the 4 archangels from such religions as Catholicism. And I'm not sure if I would actually assign Gabriel to wands, but it still works. The Queen of Gabriel is not actually Gabriel, it's a person. She's a person, and she's got this really interesting staff, which is sort of sunflower-like. She's got a cat down there, so she's got the 2 things I'm looking for. She's a very powerful, charismatic figure who obviously has some sort of, like, regalness to her that, you know, is really rare in people. So this is actually a pretty good Queen of Wands. The Nine of Michael instead of the Nine of Swords. This is weird because it looks like it's a labyrinth reference. Like, I can see how this might be nightmares or, like, weird things coming at you in the dark, but it's like, oh my gosh, a mystical owl is going to fly into my window. There are not unhappy cards in this deck. Every single deck is, like, sparkle fluff blowing up your butt. So it's super, super positive, but it's still actually read well, and it's really, really weird to say. Don't get this deck as your primary deck. It's really weird that so many of the cards are renamed, and I think that it's important to have darker stuff in your deck, and this one really just sort of papers that over. But if you want to, like, do, like, maybe a career reading or a pick yourself up reading, like a feel nice reading, this is a really good deck for it. And if you're ever, like, just looking at general deck construction, I found this deck to be really interesting to look at. So, now let's take a look back here. This is one of the Steampunk Tarots. There are several that I have found out there. Let me get this so we can see. This is a weird deck. Let me go get the exact name of it. So, It says the Steampunk Tarot, Wisdom from the Gods of the Machine by John and Caitlin Matthews. So it's that Steampunk Tarot and not some other Steampunk Tarot you've heard of. I know that there are at least 3. So this one is very story-based, and I have not read the stories. And I think that you really need to have read these stories to really understand these cards the best. They do rely on some base symbolism that you could interpret easily, but they're definitely their own storytelling thing. So the Fool is the apprentice, and I'm not really getting like the bewilderment and the general noobness that comes with the Fool when it comes to this card. This person looks a little bit too like sure of themselves, or has come into a lot of power as opposed to a lot of new beginnings. So that's just my general feeling on it. The 9 of Airships, I guess that you're being tortured by this creepy guy. I guess that's a nightmare. I don't know what's going on here, and I am really weirded out by this dude. A lot of these cards, like this is a very photo-based card with Photoshop on top of it, and I'm guessing that a lot of these people are like friends of the authors or something, because they look very specific people-wise, but they don't always seem like they have much connection to the meaning of the card. So the suspension tank instead of the hanged man, he still has that same position that he's hanging in, the position of meditation. So that's still there. And it almost looks like this is on stage or something. It's really weird. The story probably makes it make sense. Then we have the Lady of Engines as opposed to the Queen of Wands. If you've noticed, the suits in this deck are really weird because you've got engines, airships instead of swords, and then there's leviathans instead of pinnacles, and submersibles instead of cups. So it's all based on like steampunk technology. They do a lot of stuff with backgrounds and world building. It's just, this is really scholarly and nitpicky for a Queen of Wands. So I don't really know how I feel about it. I'm looking for someone with like a lot more authority and ambition and just general regalness, and I'm not really getting that from this one. This looks like it's their own story thing that they've got. That's probably really interesting, but it doesn't really come together as a tarot deck for me. It's more like an art project. So then I've got this Japanese deck, and I have actually forgotten the name of it, and I'll probably just like write it down there because seriously, the box is in Japanese and I can't read this much Japanese. So I can read a little bit, but it's an interesting deck. I saw some previews of it on a tarot site, and I was like, oh, those cards look so beautiful. I must try getting this deck because then I could have like a non-Western deck that could have some really interesting and unique approaches on tarot. And so I did that. And then I found out all the number cards are basically just the thing over and over. And that was really disappointing because every other card that isn't a number card in this deck is so interesting and so unique. And so it was really a disappointment to get it and just find that it's almost like getting a deck that is only the major arcana. So, like I said, this is all you're going to get when it comes to the number cards. The aces are fully illustrated. They have people on them. The royals are fully illustrated, and the major arcana are fully illustrated. But there's just no effort on the number cards. So, the Fool, much different than you usually see. This is a very Japanese deck, and there's going to be symbolism in here that you will not understand if you're not familiar with symbolism from Japan. So kind of keep that in mind if you do want to take the plunge on this one. I find that the art is really beautiful, but it can be a difficult deck to read. The Hanged Man is really interesting. There's a lot going on in this deck. They're actually sort of hanging down, but also reflecting, if you can see that. And there's a lot of imagery in the background. There's just like a lot going on in this card. So I think this is actually a really good card for the Hanged Man. The Queen of Wands is alright. Because I don't really know a lot of the symbolism behind this particular choice of clothing, I'm not really sure what they're trying to do. I mean, that looks like a Taoist priest's staff. Kinda. And I'm not really sure why she'd have that. But maybe that's just because that's what the wands look like in this deck. So, I have this deck for the art. Here's the back of it. It's interesting to have, but I can't really read very well with it. And the cardstock is really weird. It's extremely shiny, and it seems like it's actually been punched out of this weird laminated stock. Like there's actually punch marks still on there. So I don't think it's actually not very good to shuffle with, and really hard to handle. So not very recommended unless you're just interested in studying the art. In which case, if you have the money to spend and you can find it on Amazon, then nothing holding you back. So this is the Thoth deck. Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris put their heads together for this one. Crowley was the one who put together a lot of the symbolism and general theory behind the deck, but Lady Frida Harris also had quite a lot of input, and she also did the paintings. Those two were very good friends, although they fought a lot as well. So they had some disagreements when it came to this deck and the art that went into it. If you like Crowley, you'll like this deck. If you don't like Crowley, you probably don't want this deck. Capiche? If you're trying to learn any sort of Hermetic stuff, Kabbalah with a Q, Western esotericism, alchemy, this is a good deck to be using while you're doing that learning because you can help meditate on that stuff. There is so much symbolism in here for you, like you wouldn't believe. But if you're not interested in any of that stuff, I don't think this is a good deck to get, because that's the symbolism it's all based on. This is also a deck where you really want to buy the book that comes for it. The little white book that comes with this deck can give you a little bit on the symbolism, but not nearly enough. If you want to use this deck, then just go ahead and buy Crowley's Book of Thoth, because he's got like a little mini chapter devoted to each card. And he'll go on to his little Crowleyisms, and he'll talk about like weird Gnostic tangents and weird stuff that was going around the turn of the century and was actually like really recent science for him. It's kind of weird to read, but I find it entertaining and informative. So this is a good study deck. If you're already into this stuff, then it's a good deck to get. If you're interested in getting into this stuff, it's a good deck to get. If you don't want to have anything to do with that stuff, then don't worry about the Thoth. It's not necessary. So that's basically all the decks that I either read with or refer to for interesting art purposes. And a lot of my thoughts on tarot, I guess. So thanks for joining me.